Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone. I hope you had a good lunch break. I hope your minds and bellies are full after that. And as Michael said, a little context. I'll start. First of all, it's Thanksgiving in the United States. So here in my household, the smell of turkey is wafting through the air. And I want to start it out with some acknowledgments, some gratitude, and some of my positionality in relation to the topic that we're talking about today. I guess I'd like to start by thanking my husband, who is also an administrator and faculty member in higher education. He has been a vice president for student affairs. And I tell you that because we often joke in our house, with the enemy, the faculty member. We have a lot of experience with sort of safe space programming at, sort of 12 different institutions. So I wanted to contextualize that a bit today. But then I also didn't want to pass our contemporary moment. We're going to be talking about safe spaces. And I think this weekend in the United States, with the incident, the shooting, the violence, the death that sort of hangs over us is important to acknowledge. And so for me, that's a heavy weight because I study gay bars. In fact, my dissertation research was on the importance of gay bars and also looked at gay bars as both safe spaces and exclusionary spaces. So one of my dissertation research, one of the studies or analysis focused specifically on how lesbians are excluded from gay male space. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through the day today, but I thought we really needed to acknowledge that as an important moment weighing on people as we discuss safe spaces. I also wanted to acknowledge the important historical legacies of our spaces, especially as they relate to the 2S LGBTQ positive community. Gay bars are the start of gay rights in the United States, led by people of color, led by drag queens, led by trans identified individuals. And so I think it's important to keep them in mind as we have our conversation today. As Michael alluded to, I think it's also important to acknowledge that we have similar and different cultural contexts in North America, and specifically our relationship between the United States and Canada. While we have a lot of commonalities, we also have a lot of differences in the progress we've made around 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And both of us, both countries still have a very lot of work to do. A little bit about me. Michael mentioned that I joined the University of Waterloo faculty. I think given the spirit of our talks this morning a lot of my movement, I joined the faculty in 2015 at the University of Waterloo. And I think we had a lot of increased visibility and conversations around 2S LGBTQ plus content, history, programming that coincided with that. So when I arrived in 2015, again, with experience doing this queer activism and queer scholarship, both on multiple campuses and in my research, I was smart enough to pause for a year to make sure I understood the cultural context, to make sure I understood more about Canadian history and legislation. And so I came to Canada as an immigrant, but at the same time brought my own positionalities with me, my theories of critical race theory, lesbian, gay, bisexual theory, trans theories inform that work, as does queer theory. My methods are multiple, but almost all qualitative in nature and all focused in theories of social justice. But today, those methods include my teaching methods, which are also grounded in experiential education and some specific theories that we'll talk about in just a moment. Also, my lived experience, I always say I identify as gay at home and queer on campus. And what I mean by that is that my lived experience and my relationships are gay identified, but when I show up as an activist, I identify as queer in the ways that allows me to disrupt spaces in some meaningful and productive ways. My professional experience, I do social justice research on 2S LGBTQ populations. and at their intersections with things like race, class, ability, so on and so forth. And I brought that professional experience as a full professor to the University of Waterloo. And I'll talk a little bit more about the context of the University of Waterloo. My colleagues this morning, Lauren, Brandon, and David, mentioned that it's important that we consider context in the replication of programs like this one, because the context will be different. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I'll talk more about the context of the University of Waterloo in just a moment. But a few minutes into my presentation already, I want to acknowledge Jeremy Steffler, the students of GLOW at the University of Waterloo, Diana Perry, Lori Campbell, Ian Orchard, and Gina Heckman, who were really instrumental. And if I've forgotten folks who might be on the call from the University of Waterloo, my apologies in advance. I think it's important for us to contextualize this, and my keynote presenters in the morning, again, Lauren, Brandon, and David, but also Jasper, Ty, and Michelle, did a really effective job at laying the groundwork, both with the reasons that we need to do this work on our campus, grounded in research, and the lived experiences of the students, faculty, and staff that use our campuses to advance educational purposes and research. I mean, we know about microaggressions, negative life events. I always ask, do you know the laws where you live? Do you know the laws where you're sending your students? One of the things that came out of our programming was a real sensitivity to making sure that our students know where they're going on their co-op placements and what the laws of that particular country might be. In the state of Georgia, where I came from before Canada, at most places besides educational institutions funded by the government, I could be fired for being gay. And so again, understanding the nature of the laws in your context is important for replication, and understanding the nature of how the 2S LGBTQ plus community is treated. Also felt stigma, internalization, and I want to hit home again because of the incident of Club Q, Pulse before it, the consistent ongoing threats of harm that even if you never went to a gay bar or you have no desire to go, the discourses, the messages in the media, they remind us that perhaps we don't belong. Perhaps trying to live our lives the most fully could end up in harm, violence, and even death. And so the increased risk of stress related to the spaces that we occupy obviously are important to consider. And in higher education, we're not off the hook. Also important for us to remind ourselves of the need for 2S LGBTQ plus ally trainings, because it's just good practice. I mean, we are in the academy, we are in universities. Our jobs are to educate ourselves, to educate others, and then to take that education and also educate the community. So these first two reasons for the need for 2S LGBTQ ally trainings should be quite apparent as we head into the rest of the presentation. What I'd like to do, though, before we get to reason 3, is talk a little bit about the audience for this particular training, as well as the pedagogical approach. And that's what I'll spend the next 1 or 2 minutes discussing. I think it's important we throw the word ally or allyship around quite a bit. And most of us don't always understand the nature of its true meaning. So I use this example from a civil rights activist in the United States. And if you're not familiar, Malcolm X was a civil rights leader at the same time as Martin Luther King Jr. And in 1964, he responded with a quote that said, "By visibly hovering near us, they are proving that they are with us. But the hard truth is this isn't helping to solve America's racist problem." And he goes on to say that we really needed to understand America's racism through our fellow whites by showing up and keeping in mind that we all have privilege. And whether we're acting as an actor, ally, or accomplice, we're still part of this oppressor class. Now, what is the distinguishing features between an actor, an ally, and an accomplice. I think it's important for setting the goals of your intended audience with any sort of safe space training program. So here, for the one time during my presentation, let me consult a little theory that sort of emphasizes that an actor really doesn't disrupt the status quo, but is more like a spectator at a sporting event. And their participation or their observation really doesn't affect the overall outcome. And so actors don't really challenge systems. But on the other hand, an ally does. So an ally in this case, and I like this quote, I'm going to quote Lila Watson, who says that allies help me, or I'm sorry, let me start over. So Lila Watson says, quote, "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And so this is the move from actor to accomplice, and allyship is a nice stop along the way. I like to, as many scholars do, Chris Linder included, use ally as a verb, one that means we are enabling to act as an ally, and we shouldn't bestow that title upon ourselves. And Francesca Ramsey has a really great video that I'm going to populate in the chat and make sure that Eric can populate in our resource page. But it's a really accessible way. She talks about the 5 ways of being an ally, and it's really good and accessible. You can share it on social media, but it's also grounded in research literature. But most importantly, most people are unfamiliar with what it means to be an accomplice. And so the actions of an accomplice are meant to directly challenge institutional racism, colonization, white supremacy, and all of the other isms that include cisism, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those sorts of things. And we don't act out of a level of guilt or shame, but instead we put aside that emotional fragility and we get to work. We apologize when we make those errors, but we are committed. And the commitment shows up a lot of times. Most times we can see accomplices moving resources to marginalized groups to make sure that we can advance our agenda. So as we started thinking about and talking about building a safe spaces program, and my apologies, at the University of Waterloo, we started to focus on what kind of pedagogical strategy we wanted to use. And I'll leave these here for you to consume, but multicultural education, anti-racist education, inclusive education, and abolitionist education are 4 that I typically employ in my social justice pedagogy. Given the audience of attempting to get actors to actualize towards becoming allies or engaging in ally behavior, I decided that an inclusive education approach was probably the best. But you'll see when we get to our final slide where we talk about some of the pragmatics, you'll see the abolitionist influence of some of my colleagues on campus, as well as some of my own readings and work in that area, start to influence the Making Spaces program. Now, some of you might be asking, why am I calling it Making Spaces? And here we're to the 3rd point of my need for an 2S LGBTQ ally training program. So I arrived in 2015 at the University of Waterloo, who, according to most, have the longest running 2S LGBTQ plus student organization in Canada. And yet they had no ally training program, which seemed really odd in 2015. I began building those relationships to understand why, and that's when Jeremy Stuffler, another important community activist and a staff member on our campus, began consulting with me so that I could understand not only the history of the campus, but the history of Canada, as well as the legislations that guide the university. And that was really important, especially for an American arriving on a campus and not having much of that background, but still being shocked that we didn't have a safe space ally sort of training program. I decided we should jump ahead of the game and do our readings and look at other ally training programs and try to create one that addresses some of the critiques of safe space programs. Now, some places, safe space programs are called safe space or positive space or ally programs, and that might be okay. But such terminology does assume that a space is somehow stable, and what's positive for one person is universally applicable. And we know that's just not the case. In all of the previous safe space programs I have been involved with, they were very white, they were very cisgender, and we needed them to sort of expand. And of course, my own work employs Crenshaw's basic foundational ideas of intersectionality. And I cite Crenshaw here because it's really important. A lot of people pick up intersectionality and think really it's just the crossroads of two social identities, but it's actually more complex than that. So I always encourage folks to do their reading before they employ intersectionality to make sure that they're adhering to its theoretical tenets. And we did our best to do that, although I will admit that we haven't always been successful. But our use of making spaces kept us reflecting the need for this continuous examination and effort to create inclusive environments. And it doesn't let us off the hook. You'll even see that in 2016, we developed this visual indicator that's on your slide. And probably University of Waterloo needs to take another look, because as you'll see here in 2022, advancing on 2023, we're much more likely, especially in Canada, to use 2S LGBTQ+. So again, constantly keeping these safe space or ally training programs under scrutiny is super important. And the name of the program forces that constant recollection. We have some outcomes. They're typical outcomes that you would see with the Making Spaces program. Things like learning language, LGBTQ 101, also garnering the perspectives of faculty, staff, and young people. And then also asking our faculty and staff before they leave the program to make sure that they're really committed and prepared to participate in something like LGBTQ 2S Making Spaces program. Our agenda, I'm not going to belabor it because of our time together today, but we do review campus policies and human rights legislation. We talk and engage in experiential activities around things like a invisible minority exercise, which allows people who maybe have only experienced power and privilege in their life to see what it feels like to succumb to the power of a dominant group. We, of course, have LGBTQ2S 101 and language. We have coming out stars or flowers activities. And again, the constant scrutiny and reflection. I've named that twice just to be a note to myself. We changed coming out stars to coming out flowers in the middle of the program because one of our participants said that it felt very much like a Holocaust star, and we didn't want to sort of tread on that cultural insensitivity. So we changed it to flower petals instead of points of a star. For those of you using that exercise, maybe a heads up for future planning. And we also cover heterosexism, cissexism, homophobia, and transphobia. And then finally, we have a registration event. That's a 60-minute event after our break that allows for a lived experience panel from our students. It allows us to collectively develop an action plan. And then all of our participants go away from the training, come back and sign an affirmation statement that sort of articulates their commitment. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up. I think I just have another minute or two with some of the pragmatics worth our attention. And I'm happy to attend to any additional ones in our Q&A forum, should we have a few minutes for that. But the first is to make sure that you have the content expertise and lived experience of people who the training is for and about, that you consider power across your team and in your team, especially as it relates to the university environment. So we made sure we had a tenured faculty member, a staff person. The GLOW students of our student organization were very involved. You have to consider things like group size, trainings, what is the capacity of your group. We also collaborated in our programming with the Office of Training and Professional Development and the Gender and Sexual Diversity Working Group. This is very important important. We seeked endorsement from the administration, but not approval. And that always remained the case, at least from 2016 until I went on sabbatical and then left the institution after. So that was 2019. And so we always maintained the program separate and distinct from the institution, and always kept it voluntary as opposed to mandated. And I'm happy to explain more about that should the occasion call for it. We talked a little bit already about the importance of affirmation statements, making sure people are committed to what they're signing up for. It's not just about putting a sticker on your door and then 20 years later, still having that sticker on the door when your language, when your content, when your expertise is outdated. And so we offer ongoing professional development as a part of the Making Spaces program. We do train the trainers. So if you've been through the program once and you become a trainer, you want to become a trainer, you can do that by going through a subsequent training program. And we also have pocket experts around campus. Pocket experts are people who have volunteered to read up on certain issues like records, name changes, some of the things, restrooms, washrooms, like the folks we're talking about this morning. And then we designed Making Spaces to be a framework to add additional education programs. So not just to focus on 2LGBTQS+, but also to look at disability, to look at women-centered spaces, to look at all of those other social identities that are sometimes marginalized by the powerful, to create educational programs that this Making Spaces program could be a model for. And then finally, I'll conclude there, probably just a minute or two over, and I'll take any questions, comments, or critiques.
Thank you, Corey. We do have a couple of questions, and just to remind folks, if you have a question, please pop it into the Q&A, and I'm happy to share. So what's involved in the action plan is one of the questions. So maybe you could speak to that briefly.
Yeah, so one of the things that we found really important was that we couldn't just offer training and then not offer things for people to go out and do. So what we do is we conclude each training with two questions. What is one thing you as an individual can leave here today and do to make our community better for 2S LGBTQ+? And then the second question is, what is one thing in your university station, your office, your student organization, at a structural level, what's one thing that you can start working on to make a difference on our campus? And what we did is we would collect those, we would generate a list, and then once you signed your affirmation statement, you would get access to all of the commitments that everyone had made. 300 people trained up to the point I left. So potentially 300 ideas, right, of things that you could do to make a difference. These form and shaped our action plans. And they also informed and shaped the action plans of the Gender and Sexual Diversity Working Group on our campus. Because ultimately, this program produced a lot of the needs that our campus needed to respond to.
Great, thank you. We have two more questions. So the second one that we've received, our institution is considering a badging program indicating with a badge on the university directory whether someone's taking this kind of training. They see pros and cons. What are your thoughts?
I think it's great. I think right now we know more about the importance of representation than we ever have. And that doesn't just mean representation of ourselves as having lived experience in any particular group that might be disempowered, but to also show and represent our allyship, right? And so building things into your curriculum, having visible indicators. One of the biggest challenges we faced was on people wanting to put up their visible indicators, but being in mobile or shared offices. So we literally bought a bunch of cheap frames and put the stickers in the frames, and then people could put up their frame on their desk and take it with them. So things like that. But the cons are really like they don't get taken down when people leave. I mean, like we could generate a list. I think the pros far outweigh the cons. But you do have to have the resources to keep up with it and change things like your visual indicator when it's appropriate and timely.
Okay. Another question, is this model format or content of the program available for sharing with other institutions?
The answer is yes, but not in any published form quite yet. although I've been, toying with that idea because I do think when I do presentations like this, it's differentiated enough that perhaps it warrants our publication attention. So we'll see, but I'm happy to share the model. I know Jeremy Steffler is as well, if he's closer to home. Yeah, it's all shareable. Just reach out.
Great, thank you. And another question, can you speak to the power in visibility exercise and any ethical concerns of having folks engage in exercises that mimic marginalization?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so we're very clear about, challenge by choice, a very recreation oriented and student affairs oriented too, right? Sort of a pedagogical philosophy. So we offer that at the outset. And we make sure that we have some more skilled challenges, and but again, with adequate preparation, those dialogues and those unpacking of those issues typically are effective.
Corey, your internet paused for a second. I think you were emphasizing the importance of the skilled facilitators and training there and being able to respond to that. Is that correct?
That is correct. So one of the models that we use is, in our train the trainer model, you have to run a Making Spaces program at least 5 times with a skilled facilitator before we would let you sort of do it on your own. So we're always leveling up and making sure our facilitators have the utmost skill. But you're right, there are instances where you're just going to have to navigate it as best as you can. And again, the coming out stars / flowers is a great example of that. I feel fortunate that I was in the room as one of the facilitators the day that we had to have that dialogue, because it was quite sensitive and treaded a lot of ethical boundaries. So I do think the skilled facilitator is probably your best equipment in addressing those sorts of issues.
Okay, thank you. Well, those were all of our questions. I want to say a big thank you, Corey, to you for leading us through this talk, giving us so much to think about. I think inspiring. I saw some claps earlier, some expressions of thanks, more coming up on the screen there now. And thank you for locating your work and talking about the significance of that as well, and sharing your own journey coming from the US, becoming familiar with the Canadian context and the context at the University of Waterloo. And just an overall thank you.